Just a heads up, this episode contains a certain four-letter word that is part of a book title. This episode is part of the Season 2 series on self. Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds, where we explore the intersection between art and well-being. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. Do you avoid difficult conversations? I know I do. It's the way I was raised. I remember my mother often saying about certain topics, "Pam, I just don't want to know." And guess what? I didn't particularly want her to know either. I've always thought that there was a certain wisdom in picking and choosing which conversations to have and which ones to just sweep under the rug. I mean, do I really want to know things that will just upset me? What we don't know can't hurt us, right? On the other hand, maybe it can. My guest on today's episode, the writer Ceci Najar, has convinced me to rethink this. At 48, Ceci found herself in a 20-year unhappy marriage and at a dead end in her career as a writer. She realized that she had been acting from a script of all the negative things she believed about herself. Ideas from experiences in a dysfunctional family and her experiences of being Mexican American and an immigrant in spaces that really weren't welcoming to her. If she was going to take control of her life story, she would need to work through this layer of limiting self-beliefs and consciously reset to get the life that she wanted. This involved lots of actual writing about herself and to herself. Was this storyline of her life the truth of who she was? She didn't think so. Ceci's quest involved a pretty unconventional strategy, which you'll hear about in our conversation. She's written a memoir about this part of her life called Unfuckupabale, a love story. How many people were living lives that weren't fulfilling to them or meeting their needs because they were avoiding talking about difficult things? Ceci decided that if she really wanted a new life, she would have to become strong enough to have those conversations. Cecilia Najar is a writer living in Los Angeles, California. She goes by Ceci, and she has written, reviewed, and optioned screenplays and has also taught screenwriting. I first met Ceci as an undergrad at Brown University. She was someone I really looked up to. She struck me as incredibly confident, worldly, and was an amazing camera person. We actually had another conversation recorded that I was going to use for this podcast, and when we talked, we both found out that we each had a lot of feelings of being in over our heads at Brown. I felt that way because I had gone to a public school in Arkansas, and when I got to Brown, I was overwhelmed by the education and cultural experiences of my classmates. But I was shocked to find out that Ceci, who seemed to have it so together in my eyes, was experiencing some similar feelings of inadequacy. I won't say too much more about it because we talk about it in our conversation, but I'm really glad that we were able to have this difficult conversation that we weren't brave enough to have when we first met. Before we meet today's guest, I want to tell you about an app called Newsly. Newsly is an all-in-one audio super app for iOS and Android. There really hasn't been an app like Newsly before now. Newsly picks up all of the trending articles on the web and reads them to you in a natural human voice. You can find any topic you're interested in, sports, politics, or art. I've loved using this app. I listen to it when I'm commuting or when I'm gardening or while I'm cooking, anytime where I want to catch a little bit of news, but my hands are full or I can't stop to read. You can also find trending podcasts from over 50 countries on Newsly, including Art Heals All Wounds. Newsly has become my go-to listening app for podcasts. If you want to try Newsly yourself, just download it from www.newsly.me. And if you use the promo code ARTHEALS, you'll get a free 1-month premium subscription. I'll include all of this info in the show notes so that you can just click on the link and use the Art Heals promo to get your free trial. Now, let's meet this week's guest. Hi, Ceci. Thank you so much for being on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by telling us who you are and what you do?
My name is Cecilia Najar, and my friends call me Ceci, and I'm a writer. And I've just finished a memoir called Unfuckupabale, a love story.
Yes, and I'm just going to be clear with everybody that you and I had a conversation a couple of months ago. And it was a great conversation. We learned a lot about each other. And towards the end of our time, I just threw out there, well, what are you doing now? And you brought this up. You brought up the theme of the book. And I was kind of looking at the time like, oh my gosh, there's so much more to say about this, but we've kind of already gone over. And I just was sort of like, oh, okay, that's really interesting. And then you let me read an early draft of it, and I couldn't put it down. And I had so many questions, and I just thought, we have to redo. We have to talk again. So just, in a nutshell, if you have a nutshell, what is this memoir focus on? What is it about?
This book is about taking control of your life by taking control of your story. And I struggled creatively, and I struggled in my marriage. I was married for 20 years. And I realized that my life at the age of 48 was entirely defined by what I was telling myself and what the narrative that I was living. And I decided to do something a little bit radical to reframe and shift my relationship to men. And I went on to a website called Ashley Madison, and for reasons that I'll explain later, and in order to shift my relationship to men. And in the process, I ended up falling in love with one man and learned, again, through that relationship, how I was living a story that was keeping me from love. And in the process of living that relationship, I found a new story. And so we got married, and I completed this book. So it is a love story, but within that love story, it is about finding your center and framing the story of your life to give you the life that you want.
Yes. And if I give any details away from your book that you don't want me to tell, we can just cut it out. But there will be some people listening who don't know that Ashley Madison is primarily a relationship for people who are married, who are looking to have relationships outside of their marriage. And
yes.
And so it's hard for me to just pretend that I don't have all these questions and reactions that I do. You got so much pushback from your friends for doing this.
That is an understatement. I was literally shunned. And look, the topic of infidelity, especially in our age group, is very triggering. It is, and let's also acknowledge the fact that we live in a very patriarchal society, and security for women largely has been through marriage. We did not get the same kind of access to income, the same access to job security, the same access to so many structures that would have made women's lives stable on their own. So infidelity, rightfully so, brings up a lot of big issues. In this case, I tried to explain to my friends that I was in the middle of an experiment, and that I was not actually interested in having an affair, but I definitely was shooting fish in a barrel, meaning that then in my entire life that there was only one category of men who reliably hit on me, and that was married men. And I don't, and for
Wow.
years I thought, I must just have a sign on the back of my shirt that says, lousy for marriage, good in bed. I didn't know why this was. So I just thought, well, I'm going to use this to my advantage. If I want to churn through a bunch of men quickly to find out why men who have authority over me or men who have power over me, I just wanted to stab with a fork at all times. And I thought, well, that's not a good way to have a relationship, right? That's going to cause problems. And that was my strategy. My strategy was I'm going to run through a bunch of men who I'm going to select as having some authority in the world, and then see why I show up to the table with so much anger. And then
Mm.
could I process that anger, and could I move through it? So that was my thinking. Yeah.
Right. Well, you've brought up three things that I want to comment on. So the first one is that, as it turned out, not all of these friends who were super angry with you had been completely faithful themselves. So, although many of them were triggered, finally, at one point, a lot of them admitted to you that they had also had affairs, whether they were married or whether they had seen married men. So, I thought that was interesting. And I sort of felt like it got to the point of one of the points of your book, which is about honest conversations. And then the other thing that was really interesting to me is that you're talking about this as an experiment, and you really did go through a lot of men, but it's not like you had affairs with a lot of men. You got lots of responses to your ads, and you did something super interesting. And again, I don't want to give away too much of the book so that people, when they read it, but you really worked on what your response to these men would be. And often, if they were crude, if they were rude, if they were disrespectful, you would address that without anger and then sort of end it with, we are not a match, which I love that we are not a
Yeah.
match. And so you do go through a lot of men, but not through a lot of affairs. You really are instead like almost taking a step back and noticing your own reaction to what they're saying, and
Mm-hmm.
then thinking about how it is that you would like to respond that does not involve anger. So that's one thing I want to say about this interesting thing in your experiment. You have something to say, but help me remember, I want to go back to this idea of anger. So,
Okay. Well, you also bring up my friends who considered me crazy. It was anger and also very disappointed with me for breaking a very big moral code, breaking the girl code, breaking the woman code. You
mhm.
don't cheat on, and you don't allow other husbands to cheat. And in this particular case, I thought this is a life experiment. And also I was sort of tired of feeling like that the rules were different for men and women,
Mhm.
that men have had, that I have been the object of so many married men's interest.
Mhm.
And so it was curious to me why we didn't talk about this as any kind of,
Mhm.
sort of an honest way. And also why there were so many people on this Ashley Madison Affair website. And I just decided that I was going to run the experiment and be honest about it. And I told anyone who asked me, how are you doing now that you've left your husband? I would say, well, I'm now dating married men on this experiment that I'm doing. So I didn't want to own the shame of this. And I wanted to even shift the conversation in my own life. And in doing so, with that kind of honesty, you are often faced with uncomfortable conversations. And my friends had a lot of uncomfortable conversations with me. And I lost friends in addition.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I did want to go back to this idea of anger, and then you brought up this idea of shame, this idea of honesty. And this is a memoir. So when I ask you questions, none of this is meant to villainize any of the other players in the story. But one person that I go back to a lot in this story is your dad.
Mm.
And I think, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think from your dad, you learned that what you don't know can hurt you. And not having honest conversations about reality can really come up and hurt you. And I say that because, your dad is, or was, he was from Mexico. He was a doctor. He had a very, very high sense of what he wanted for himself and for his children. And he lived a certain lifestyle that was outward signs of success. And he didn't want you to go to public school because there were a certain type of Mexicans there that he didn't want you to know. And instead, he took you to this elite private school, which in one way, you really understand a parent wanting their child to go to an elite private school, but then you were treated to this sort of casually cruel racism there about not being able to go to certain parties, not being able to go to certain places because you were Mexican American. So I feel like I kind of think about that with your dad and that experience, and like parents wanting the best for their children and projecting what they think is the best onto their children and maybe having some blind spots. But then also, it turns out that, and you were very gifted. You got into Brown University and you were going there. And it turns out that, in fact, your dad didn't have the means for you to be there. Is that true, or am I?
Well, yes. And actually, I don't know. I know that he got into trouble. Well, so my dad was a doctor. He was Mexican. I was born in Mexico. My mother was Canadian. So we lived a very much the immigrant experience in Southern California. Both my mother didn't know how. My mother also grew up in foster homes and in an orphanage. So she didn't have a lot of life skills in this culture. And my dad did not have a lot of life skills in this culture. So he loved American, what was American. He only drove American cars. He loved that concept of success, and he wanted his children to be that successful. And so we did not speak Spanish at home, even though Spanish is my first language. So he wanted to raise American children. And part of his sense of that was the caste system that we have in this country is white and it's privileged. And in Los Angeles, there's a bandwidth of white Catholic, upper crusty, big lawns and big houses and mansions. And so he wanted me to be part of that world. And he was so proud that I did get to Brown, but he also wanted me to be a doctor. And because he was a doctor. And so I don't know, he did get in trouble with the tax situation. And he also at that moment left my mother for a new life, in essence, because he said he just couldn't make money in Los Angeles. But you're right in the sense that I learned from him how confusing it is when people don't tell the whole truth, and how many stories you make up in your own world about your value and about your security, your safety in the world, when you don't really understand what's happening, and that you're in an environment of withheld information. And I can say that certainly one of the themes of my book is how do we live in integrity in relationships, right? That we want autonomy, and we want the ability for individuality, and yet we want to be connected. But sometimes that connection requires really uncomfortable moments if you want to be honest about your needs.
You started this experiment. You left a marriage of 20 years. And again, not vilifying anybody, but this husband you were with for 20 years was definitely a part of the story you were telling yourself that seemed to be based on, well, I just have to take what I can get. This person loves me, even though he wants things that I don't want at all. He's doing things which I'm not thrilled with. And we're living in a place where I really, really don't want to be. And it was sort of like this boing, like I'm sure it didn't just come up one morning you woke up and said, I'm not going to do this anymore. But there was sort of that kind of clarity in the book of just like, nope, I'm not going down this path anymore. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So, again, not growing up in a family that had, where my parents were, I saw a lot of love in my parents' lives. I didn't really know what love looked like and what a long-term love looked like. And so it's what I read in the culture, what I heard on the radio, what I saw on television. These were the messages that told me what I should aspire to. And so some of the things that I aspired to was marry your best friend.
Mm.
Another thing I aspired to was a happy marriage is a long marriage. A happy marriage is the one that lasts. And I had a friend who was 50 years, who got married on the same day that I did 50 years before. And she said, there were times that I didn't even like my husband, but, a year later it was fine. So I grew up really thinking that marriage was about compromise, that marriage was about all of the things that the Bible said, love is kind, love is selfless. So in that paradigm, there's a lot of wiggle room for unhappiness.
There is, but I was also going to say, I think in your story, you were the only person who seemed to be doing the most compromising. It seemed like the vision of where you were living, how you were living, was somebody else's vision, definitely not yours. And it seemed like you had spoken up, but there's kind of this like, oh, come on, it's great. And you'd sort of be cajoled into accepting it.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And that was, look, I married my best friend, and I really was and I am a very flexible, malleable person. I'm not somebody who has very fixed ideas of the way the way my life should go. And I expected that one day it would be my turn. And I expected that one day he would really get me. And I also had a certain amount of loyalty, but it really, really came down to the story that I told myself about myself, which was, I am not that lovable. And he would tell everyone how lovable I was. He would say how much he loved me to the world. And so I really believed that on the scale of love, I had gotten as best as I could get.
Mm-hmm.
And love didn't promise a happy life. Love just promised love. And I accepted that.
That is so fascinating. And I just think of how many people have that same experience. I mean, I can say that I certainly have had that experience. Well, I also want to talk about you as a writer, because this is something I found out in the conversation we had before. And when I read your book, again, I'm going back to your dad, this idea of I need to do this certain thing to be successful. And for you, you are a good writer. You've always written, even if it weren't the ideal job that you were writing. And you were trying to make it as a Hollywood screenwriter at a time when, let's face it, nobody wants to hear a story like yours or a story like mine, quite frankly, in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And so it required you trying to twist yourself into all kinds of shapes to be what Hollywood defined as a successful writer. And I'm curious about that.
I think the experience of, first of all, an immigrant learns early on. There's not a lot of room, especially when I grew up. There wasn't a lot of room for difference in my world, and the same was true of Hollywood. And so I just took the skills I learned as someone who was trying to fit in to the world I was put in, to the skills of, well, if I can't write my story as a Mexican immigrant with a bent towards rock and roll and my idiosyncrasies, then I will write the stories that sell, right? Because I can write, so just give me a story that will sell. And I mean, the last project, and it almost got bought, and I finally just realized it was going to kill me to write it, and also because they weren't going to pay me to write it, was I was writing a story set in Kansas City about two dueling Black families and their barbecue joints. So it was kind of like a Romeo and Juliet romantic comedy set in the world of barbecue.
It actually sounds interesting.
I think it was a really fun story. I had no business writing about two Black families in Kansas City, but it was what somebody said that they wanted. And so I said,
Right.
okay, I'll do it. I once wrote a story about dueling stepfathers, kind of like a Arnold Schwarzenegger, Danny DeVito, dueling stepfather thing. Like things I just look back and I think, what? And because I did write two, like several other female driven comedies, romance, not a smidge of interest. So lessons learned.
Yeah. So, not achieving that dream of being this screenwriter, this selling screenwriter in Hollywood, you took that again as more of your story about yourself as opposed to a story about Hollywood. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's interesting because that's another thing which I think a lot of people can identify with, that you're just ramming into this brick wall, but you think, it's your problem for not having a harder head as opposed to the fact that the brick wall is there.
Yeah. I knew there was a brick wall there, but in the same way, like you and I both got into an Ivy League school, and it was like, well, I have a modicum of intelligence, and I know how to work hard, and I know I can get feedback, and I can, do another version. But, another thing that came up though was that the feeling that I knew I was going to be rejected. Like I knew it started to become very apparent that every meeting was going to end not so well. And whereas another writer, maybe, and actually I have friends who are successful writers who are women and who did break through that because they had something else. And I had the narrative of I don't belong, right? Because I was in a culture that as a child, I knew that I didn't really belong. I had my father's alcoholism, which also gave me a lot of shame. And I had a very judgmental father. Again, I'm not trying to make him the worst man in the world. He came from a culture and he had the same feelings of inadequacy in this culture. And he was trying to bolster me up, but the way he did it did not land well. And so I was afflicted with a terrible kind of perfectionism.
Mm.
And it was really just spiraling into overwork, where I'm rewriting and rewriting and rewriting and then can't turn it in because I'm judging myself before someone else judges me.
Mm.
And I can definitely say in the high school experience that you referenced, I experienced that a lot. I was shocked to know how much people judged me before they knew me, and how they put me in a box before I turned anything in or opened my mouth. And that experience in my later life and creative life created a paralysis that was extremely difficult to overcome. And it meant that I did feel like the more I cared about something, the less I was able to do it. And which is why I ended up being like a copywriter for the furniture industry, because I literally thought, well, I can write copy about a frickin' sofa. And I ended up doing really, really well, but it was because I had set my own bar so low.
Right.
Whereas that Hollywood bar felt like every time I walked into somebody's office, I just kind of crumbled inside because I knew I wasn't quite what they were looking for.
Well, I just want to point out the similarity between this idea of writing the furniture copy and you going for Married Men on Ashley Madison, because there was always this sense of like, this is not going to go anywhere anyway. So what do I care if,
Yeah.
whatever is affirming, I'll take that. But, who cares about these
Yeah.
guys in the long run? So that is funny to me that you took this thing and that also created this paradigm for your experiment with relationships. But that didn't turn out to be the whole truth. So I don't know. I don't know if we should do very many reveals about the outcome of your experiment on Ashley Madison, because I think that that's kind of one of the twists in the book.
It is. It is one of the twists in the book. But, just going back to our experience, so I went to Brown the first 2 years, and then my dad quit paying for my college. And then I went back again, but I paid for the second half of my college education. And so I felt like I could do anything that I wanted. And one of the things I did is I took every class pass fail. And in doing that, what was shocking about doing that is I got A's in every class. Whereas when I took it for a grade, I found that same paralysis.
Wow.
And so it is really a perfectionist's dilemma. And unplugging, like deciding for myself to let myself fail, let myself do the crazy thing, let myself break out of what society says I can and can't do, and accept the consequences, was for me a big way of unplugging that perfectionism. And certainly, and you're right, in that Ashley Madison experiment, it was partially letting the chips fall where they may and setting the bar low.
Right. What I want to talk about now, though, I want to talk about the experience of writing this book, because I see you as like this very like layered writer. I feel like when I read the book, I'm reading about a writer who is sitting there every time you were angry, upset, anything, you started writing about it. And it's like a journal, but a very, very intentional journal about processing. But now you're writing the book as something to sell. So I just want to figure out that whole bundle.
Well, so the writing, so what was very different about writing this book than anything else I've ever written in my life was I again, allowing myself to fail in a massive way. So everything that I've ever written before this was to sell. It was for a magazine. It was for an editor. It was for trying to sell, pitch to Hollywood. So I had a structure in mind. I had to follow that structure. Hollywood has a very, very strict 3-act kind of structure. I was looking at character arcs. I would map them out. Even if I was writing for a magazine, I would get the parameter, I would get the voice of what the magazine was before I wrote it, right? So there was an essential lack of authenticity in everything I did. And I knew that. So again, retraining myself to write for me was part of the path, was allowing myself to fail, and fail to the point where, what I wrote was deeply unacceptable. So I would get up and, I'd lived this story, but I would get up and I'd turn on the same playlist every single day. Begins with The Who, Eminence Front. And if you turn on the Eminence Front, you can hear that. And so that was my beginning. And I would just begin typing. And I would just say, so then I went to this, and then I decided, and so I lived, I don't know if you've ever read Anne Lamott, Bird by Bird.
Yeah.
So this was not just shitty first draft. This was super shitty first draft. And I even allowed myself to just repeat myself. Like I would not go back and reread what I wrote. I just kept going. And so I had, when I finally thought I finished the first draft, I had like 190,000 words. I mean, which is like 4 novels, and it was a mess. But in there was genius. I could see, oh, that's a good sentence. That's a great line. Oh, that's a good idea. And so I didn't presuppose the way this book would structure out.
Right.
I didn't presuppose the chapters. I didn't even presuppose what this was about. And it took a lot longer than I wanted it to. It took me about 6-7 years to write the book.
Wow.
And allow it to just simmer in its cesspool of bad, I have to say. But in that like, okay, I'm going to try again, I finally got closer and closer and closer. And then the draft that you read was the first draft that I would really let anybody read. But what I wanted more than anything was to feel authentic and to feel like my heart was on the page, and to feel like there was a raw truth there. And I knew that if I spent time structuring it and trying to imagine what the structure was before I let all of the messiness come, I would lose that. So it was frustrating, and it was hard to read an entire draft that was immeasurably bad. It was hard, and there were tears, and there was a lot of doubt that I was a good writer. I mean, it really confronted any myth I had that I was a genius or in fact a good writer. So I can only say that writing is rewriting, and that I truly believe.
I hope that you, as you do different versions of the book, that you'll let me be a reader again, because I really enjoyed it.
Oh, I would love that.
Where can people find out more about you and about the progress of the book?
So you can go, I have a website at cecilianajar.com. So that's CECILIANAJAR.com. And then I also am putting up some information on the book's website, which is Unfuckupabale, a love story.com. Because, that is the goal of the book. The goal of the book is that you find that place that's unfuckupable and be able to navigate life from there. So those are the two places you can find me.
Ah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for doing a second interview and letting me talk about this book and the things that you brought up. That was really fun.
Thank you. I'm so, so happy that you read the book and it inspired us to talk again. Thank you.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm so grateful to Ceci Najar for being on the show and for letting me read this early version of her book. I left this conversation with Ceci with two thoughts to chew on. The first one is, who's writing my life story? And then the second one was, what difficult conversations am I avoiding? What would I need to do to not be afraid of those difficult conversations? If you want to learn more about Ceci and her book, there are two places you can look. One is her website, cecilianajar.com, and to find out more about her book, you can go to unfuckupabalealovestory.com. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karina Galanian. The music you heard in the intro was by Ketsa. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. We are almost to the end of Season 2. There'll be one more episode next week to wrap things up. If you haven't taken the listener survey yet, there's still time. You can find the link in the show notes. So see you next week for what I like to think of as my listener appreciation show. Thank you.